So if you think that talking to youth is scary, intimidating, try talking to adults about youth. I think that's a lot more intimidating and scary, but it's important though, the issues that we're talking about today, and I'm glad to be here, and I thank the Roots team for having me here today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why it is important to be relational with youth in our churches. I teach a newcomers class to one of the teens at Street Light every week. So this girl wants to eventually do professional faith, so we're going through the catechism and the Bible and all the teachings of the church, which is quite a lot, especially when they haven't grown up learning it. But it's fun and it's very interesting to do. And one of the things that we went through one week was the Canis of Dort. And I'm always excited about talking about it because I was born in Dordrecht, which is actually Dort. So we were going through it and we were just talking about the importance and what it really entailed. And we were nearing the end of the lesson and the girl closed her psalm book and said, "Mika, what is the meaning of life?" So I sort of sat there and in silence, really. I didn't really know what to say. I mean, what do you expect after reading the Canis of Dort that you get such a big question? But it was good to hear, because sometimes we get so wrapped up in our teachings that sometimes teens can ground us and say, why are we here? What is the meaning of life? God, the Trinity, God our Father, is not just a name on a page or ink on paper, but He is a God who wants a relationship with His people. Perhaps that would be a short answer to her question about the meaning of life. Relationship is at the center of Christian faith. Jesus points to that when He commands us, love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, and your soul. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. Just like God is breathing and a living God who wants relationships with His people, the church too is a living and breathing body. People set apart, made holy, made for relationships. The names in your church directory are not just names on pages, not just ink, not just pictures. They are people made for relationships. So that's why we're here today, to talk about that. And maybe specifically with youth, because maybe we've neglected to talk about that a lot. So this is a great opportunity to do that. Now, why is it so important to talk about relationships with youth? All the research in the last 10 to 15 years on teenage years relating to teenage feeling, they relate to them feeling abandoned. Teenagers don't feel they have good and strong relationships or attachments to other people. And you might think that's probably nothing new. Probably teenagers have struggled with that for years and years, longer than 10 to 15 years. Maybe when you were young, you had the same feelings. However, right now they are more complex. And that's because of our social system that we have built. We have built a system that gives us opportunity and choice, but not much identity. There is no intimacy. We can blame internet, text messaging, Facebook, and other social media. But it is the product of a social system that we have developed. And now we are seeing the consequences. When a teen displays himself on the internet, they expect lots of responses, and they can, because they will. Pictures or opinions, they're easily out there. The most vulnerable thoughts are put out in public display. A cry to be understood, a cry to be known. Teens have an overwhelming desire to become a person, to become independent. They end up in role-playing games, and not a lot of people monitor it. They can do this without us even knowing. The role-playing games are not really the problem though, because they might actually give teens some connectedness which they might not have at all without it. But teens have not learned to balance their emotions, and they're very reactive. So how do teens often get attention? it is very often behaviorally driven. That means that teens get measured by the way they act or do things. And teens themselves learn to look at relationships that way as well. They look at a relationship and think, what can I get out of it? Or what can I not get out of it? These are value-oriented relationships. So genuine love and care often only happens in crisis situations, when it's maybe already too late. So we measure youth by their behavior. Everything is about what they do or don't do. And that's a problem, because it also often seeps into our churches as well. Religion becomes viewed in behavioral context. Even though a lot of teens can look at Jesus and say, I can have a relationship with Jesus, God is viewed as a moral agent. He's just seen as someone who gives us commands, tells us what we can and can't do. Am I following the right rules is something what we're constantly asking ourselves. And then to get kids involved in these moral right things, they are encouraged to participate in youth groups and other things like that. A disconnect happens very often. I don't know if you've ever watched a movie, what's it called? Breakfast Club. Yes, Breakfast Club. Yes, a classic. One of the scenes talks about the teens sitting around and talking about their parents, and he talks about how they will one day become like their parents. And one of the girls says, never, I will never become like my parent. And then one of the girls starts crying and she says, yes, you will. You can't avoid it. Your heart starts to die. And that's how often teens see it. Once we become people that are just doing things right or wrong, where do our passions go, our ambitions? And maybe you've known that when you become an adult that you see yourself as that as well. That maybe you've been in a situation where, for instance, you're in the mall and people are being rowdy. There's youth walking around, and you're like, why? They're so annoying. They're so loud. They're in the way. And all of a sudden you catch yourself and you think, when have I become like this? When did this happen? Right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing. We have worked very hard to give teens choices. We have more choices than ever before. And we hope that that produces more independence, but it has also increased confusion. Now, are we going to be there in their confusion? Are we going to be there when they have all these choices and it's so overwhelming? In the church, we've often segregated youth from adults. And I'm going to compare that to a picture for you. Growing up, I think a lot of us had pretty big family gatherings, and we'd have big meals, and big meals are great. They're a great opportunity to talk to each other, to get to know each other. They're just a great time to share. And then we would set the table, and we would have glasses like this on the big table. But then there were too many people, and the table wasn't big enough. So what did we do? Took out these cups, and that's where the kids went, right? And that's what we've done in our churches too. We've set the table to join each other, to talk, have conversation, to know each other. But what we've often done with the youth is set their plastic IKEA cups on the side. There's nothing wrong with IKEA cups. But how does youth go from that to this? Once they've graduated from youth group or have gone through that table, once they're finished their meals, how do they get to this dinner? Can they enter that just like that, or do they feel like they're no longer part of it? The adult absence has resulted in an over-reliance on another demographic, and you can probably guess what that is: the peer relationship. The reason for this split can be traced to one key origin. Chap Clark says the following: the young have not arrogantly turned their backs on the adult world, which we might often think. Rather, they have been forced by a personal sense of abandonment to band together and create their own world, separate, semi-secret, and vastly different from the world around them. And doesn't it feel like that so often? You feel like you cannot relate. I have no idea who they are. They have created this different world, and it is hard. It's hard when you see them standing in a circle, and you're like, how can I say hi without being super awkward and, being the weirdo? I think as adults, we feel like that. But in a way, we've pushed them towards that. As adults, we often push teens towards independence and responsibility with every opportunity we can afford. Yet, this time of adolescence is a time where kids still need a lot of help from adults. It's a time of confusion, discovery, and growth. Heinz writes, the second decade of life is when one's personhood becomes defined in terms of the wider world. We, as a society, need to assist this transitional period instead of ignoring it or rendering it irrelevant. There is no magic bullet to remedy the issues that adolescents face. Yet we need to be there. We need to be there in their journey. And that brings us to youth in the church. It's a whole different story there too. And I'm going to talk a little bit about grace with you. And it's something that I've experienced a lot in my work with teenagers, both at Streetlight, but also in our churches. Unintentional miscommunication can cause confusion about what the church is supposed to be. A while back, I met a young guy who came to one of our services. And after the service, we discussed the sermon. And he had a lot of questions. So I talked about Jesus and about how he saves us and how he saves you and me. And maybe I didn't do a very good job. But after I told him about it, he sighed and said, Mika, that sounds really nice, but I don't think I'm ready. I don't think I'm good enough to be a Christian. Doesn't that break your heart when teens think that? What have we done wrong when that's what they think? Have we started with grace when we have talked about our faith? Have we shared about how God has impacted our lives? If your teens don't know that the church is a place where broken people go to be healed, then how can they relate? Then how will we ever have relationships with them? Where will your teens go when they have questions about sexuality, about self-harm, about depression, about questioning faith? Where will they go if they think that adults could never understand? Maybe we have done a poor job witnessing God's grace in our own lives. Have we told our kids how God saved us? Have we shared that we felt weak at times as well? Maybe beaten down, sad, and unsure? The times where we cried out to God because of things that have happened in life and we couldn't deal with it? I'm going to talk a little bit about the church and how it's viewed. The New Testament Greek word for church is ekklesia, and it comes from ek and kaleo, meaning called out from, or the called out ones. So to think of a church as merely a building runs counter to New Testament description of the church. And this, I think, we have often portrayed, that the church is a building. However, your church is not a building. It is the people who gather in the building and then live as kingdom people the rest of the week that make the church, that are the church. So how has this affected our youth? If we think or refer to the church as a building, what does that make our youth? They are guests, the visitors at that building, and they better not make a big mess while they are visiting. So let's think about that when we think of the church. Let's make sure that we make clear that the church is not just a building. It is a living and breathing body made to have relationships. We also often use the image of the church as Christ's bride. We, as the bride of Christ, are being prepared for the coming way of marriage to the groom, who both awaits us and is purifying us for himself. Looking ahead, we wait in anticipation for the wedding feast of the Lamb, described in Revelation. The imagery of the bride of Christ is an important and biblically rooted picture. But let's think about how this imagery is misunderstood sometimes in youth ministry. All too often, teenagers are seen as part of the church future instead of the church's present. Teenagers are not just the church of tomorrow. Teenagers are the church of today. And I think that's one of our biggest struggles. Where does the youth fit in your church today? Where do they have a place? If there was no youth in your church tomorrow, would anyone notice it? Maybe just empty spots? Or would you notice it in your relationships? There would be no teen group? What else? Maybe the mission trip that year would be smaller? What else? Where does your youth fit in? And if your youth has that view as well, that they are only the youth of the future, then what are they good for now? Why are they living in a church right now? Is it just when you become married and have children that you become part of a church, that you count? Think of what it does to a teenager when they feel that way. Let's make sure that we include them in our relationships. That is why relationships are so important. If teenagers were to be gone tomorrow in your church would be hurting. That's the way it's supposed to be. Some of us speak of the church primarily along the lines of Paul's description as the body of Christ. As the body, all of us function as parts of Christ's body in our communities and across the world. In this metaphor, everyone has a place, and that place is marked by our service to the rest of the body. This is a wonderful and often used picture of the church. We want teenagers to have a sense of identity and significance, just like we said in our last point. To know that they have gifts and that those gifts can impact others. However, there is potential danger in just using this image, because it can be misinterpreted to lack a sense of relationship and instead focus on the instrumental value of the parts. It's high on mission and purpose and low on a core need of adolescence, and that is love. If teenagers are just the people that are in your babysit, or just the people that go on your mission trips, that is okay, but there needs to be more than that. They need to be loved, even when they might show you that they don't want to, which happens. If love is what we want, then this fourth and final image of the church helps us move toward that goal. The metaphor of the family of God, which appears in Scripture in 1 Peter 4, verse 17. It carries the image of a family, a tribe, or a cohesive community. This is appealing to us. It is an important image, but what is often lost in this image is the role of the biological or adopted families. In this family of God imagery, what place do teenagers' parents play in the spiritual formation of teens? Recent research continues to confirm the enormous influence parents have on their kids, for the good, the bad, and the ugly. As Christian Smith from Notre Dame explained, parents are the most dominant influence on their kids' faith. As he summarized, when it comes to faith, parents get what they are. So how can we respond? While we can't say that the issue of abandonment is the only obstacle to the faith of adolescents, research suggests that abandonment has escalated to the point that the church needs to address it. Churches are one of the best ways to generate social capital both inside and outside of the church body, through events, leaders, students, and other outreach-focused activities. Here are a few ways we can respond in youth ministry and the broader church to increase this. First of all, raise awareness. The widespread abandonment happening to adolescents needs to be brought to light in the church. Churches need to acknowledge and welcome the winding road of spiritual, social, and intellectual maturity through adolescence. Chap says the following: faith is a long, complex journey, and adolescents need someone to walk alongside them as long as it takes. And sometimes it takes long, and sometimes it's really hard, but we need to be there. Another good way would be to help adults spend time with students. Sometimes it just means simply spending time with kids. Church can be a place where students safely participate in intergenerational activities. By consistently being in the same environment as adults, kids undergo positive change. The church community can be a community that increases social capital along with increasing faith. There are some psychologists at the Fuller Youth Institute, and this is an interesting youth institute. They do research about youth in churches and about why they're leaving and what are their struggles. And they say the following: religious active adolescents reported higher level of social interaction and trust with their parents, immediate friends, and significant adults in their life. Intergenerational relationships within the church are consistently found to be positive sources of influence in kids' morality, goals, beliefs, and values. So this is important for us. Number 3, go to youth. And that's not always easy, and maybe it's even intimidating. Just this week I had an encounter with a teen during a bus ride to one of our programs. And it's not even that it happened in the program, but it was just that I was there, I guess. She sat beside me, and I think she's about 13 years old. And I said to her, "How are you doing? How are things going?" She said, "I'm fine." You know, teenagers are always fine. Anyway, we just went along in the bus drive, and it was silent for a moment, and all of a sudden she turned to me and said, "When I was a baby inside my mom's tummy, my daddy didn't want me. He hated me, so he got another lady to punch my mom in the stomach." I don't know where that all of a sudden came from. We weren't talking about that at all. We weren't talking about anything. But she had to get it off her chest. At that moment, I was a trusted adult that she needed to share it with. And the opportunity arose, and it just happened. And it wasn't that I knew really what to say. I sort of awkwardly responded and said, "Well, did your mom go to the hospital? I'm glad that you turned out fine." What do you say at a moment like that? It was a bit awkward because there were other 15 girls on the bus singing and being loud, so it was hard to talk about it. And as we pulled into the church parking lot, I sort of felt lost. I wasn't sure how to continue this conversation. What could I do to offer hope? Would she ever know how much God loves her as a father? The journey continues, however. I will be in her life, and maybe she will let me see glimpses of her heart again. Well, that's just an example of being there. And that was just a very simple thing. I was just driving on the bus. I wasn't doing anything special. For decades, organizations like Youth for Christ have been advocating for getting into their world, for the perspective of ministering to the whole kid, entering the lives of kids where they live and interact every day, helps build their social capital. In order to do this effectively, adults need to still go to where the adolescents are, but not just in geographical terms. Adults need to find out what teenagers like to do and incorporate that with the primary motive of revealing Christ. And that's not always easy, but we need to know what they are doing and where they are. And not in a way that we're policing them, but because we're interested. And that might be a little bit hard. Just like I said earlier, when you're in the mall and this group is there and you just want to react and be like, "Can you guys just be quiet? You're being so rude." Sometimes we just need to have a breather and count to 10 and think about what our actions are going to do. Another girl was on the bus on the way back, actually. Bus rides are always very eventful for me. They're like the best way to reaching out to kids. And she said, I said, are you tired? She said, no, I'm going home, watch my show. I said, oh, what's your show? What is it? Jersey Shore. I don't know if you're familiar with the show Jersey Shore, but it's basically about a bunch of teenagers that drink and have sex. I think that's about the extent of it. And I said, my first reaction was, well, inside of my head, because I'm trying to learn not to have the reaction, was like, you can't watch that, that's bad. You know, God doesn't want you to watch that. You know, that's our natural response. But what would that have done to her? She probably wouldn't have understood it. So I said to her, what is the show like? Oh, it's a good show, but I would never walk into their footsteps. I said, well, that's good. I said, what do you think about Jesus' footsteps? Would they be very different? She said, oh yeah, totally different. So we talked about that. And maybe in that way we could explore, sort of, and make her think, make her ask questions. And that's what we want teens to do. We don't just want to give them the answers, because they won't understand. They won't make faith their own. So maybe that's the kind of conversations we should have. Adults need to be intentional witnesses. We need to be more than just small group leaders, mentors, or coaches. Whole communities of adults need to start intentionally living for adolescents. What if the church was known for this? What if your specific church was that committed to increasing social capital? It would have the amazing effects. There's some findings that a certain Dr. Christian Smith and Melinda Lindquist have noticed in research on teenagers and their faith. Finding number 1, parents and adults are the primary influence of spiritual formation. Parents and other adults exert huge influence in the lives of North American adolescents, whether for good or ill. And whether adults can perceive it or not, when it comes to religious faith and most other areas of teens' lives. The study also found that parents and other adults, as the number 1 influence of teenagers' religious faith and practice. The influence of parents and adults was found to be so strong that Smith and Denter referred to the common cultural assumption that a teenager's peer group is more influential than that of adults in teenagers' lives as badly misguided. We often think that. We think like their friends, they're the biggest influence, but it's not true. Adults and parents are. That's sort of encouraging for us to know, because they will never tell you that. And I think you will notice that in conversation too, that you might talk about something and they might not agree, and then they go to their friends, they talk about it, and they have the same opinion as their parents. I've done that when I was young, but I won't tell my parents that. Finding number 2, youth ministry programming is important. Well-developed, congregational-based youth groups with established youth leaders likely provide teens who lack parental support appealing doorways into and relational ties, encouraging greater religious participation in the life of religious congregations. This demonstrates the importance of youth ministry programming in the body of Christ. We should notice that it says, though, that it is in the absence of parental encouragement, so it still cannot replace the parental and adult influence on a youth's life. Youth group doesn't replace that. Finding number 3, teenage spirituality is a reflection of adult spirituality. And maybe that makes us think for a moment and think about our own lives. The religion and spirituality of most teenagers actually strike us as very powerfully reflecting the contours, priorities, expectations, and structure of the larger adult world. Teenagers pick up their religious cues from the surrounding adult culture. As a result, Smith and Denton found the religious world of teenagers quite like that of the adult world. So it's a reflection of our circles of what we do. And let's think about that. And maybe there's some things, some areas that we need to be working on. If we can't be talking about our faith life, if we can't be relational, then how do we ever expect our teenagers to be? I think it's very easy for adults to expect a lot from teenagers. I've seen it in many ways in the way that we will put chairs in a circle and put teenagers in them and ask them, how's your faith? What are your fears? And a teenager goes, what? Right? Or they just give you little answers. Why? Because what are we expecting from them? They're just going to open up like that? Is there a relationship? Do they trust you? Have you shared your faith? So often we do this. And then we're so surprised that they don't want to talk about it, right? Or give us answers that are just sort of simple answers. And sometimes it just means that we have to be very honest. I've had a group of girls before that we were doing devotions, and every question that we asked, they just gave me this answer that I wanted to hear. I was getting really frustrated with it. And I tried different ways. I tried, to be sneaky about it and get them to open up. But it wasn't working. They were just not opening up. They were just giving me the right answers. But I didn't want just answers. I wanted questions. You see, if your teenagers aren't asking questions, that is a big concern for me. So finally, I was so discouraged that I was just honest with them, and I said, I don't know why or what, but I was just hoping that we could talk about our faith, and I don't know everything. I don't have all the answers, but I would love to wrestle with it with you together. And I was just very honest about the situation that we were in. And they were sort of shocked at first. And I thought, oh no, what have I done? Now they're even more awkward. But it did something. And they opened up and they were willing to share. Because I admitted that I didn't know everything. And I wanted to be on a jury alongside with them. So let's try that. Practical steps forward. Get parents involved in youth ministry programming. In other words, stop focusing on pulling parents and other adults away from teenagers. I think that has happened a lot in our churches. Once you turn a certain age, you go to your other groups. There's probably like 100 different age groups in our churches. And that's too bad because we need you. Teenagers need you. And like I said before, they won't tell you that. Most likely not. Or maybe after this whole journey is done. But they need you. And you have so much to offer. Parents and other adults need to be involved in the teaching of their teenagers. Remember, great teachings begin with the building of great relationships with teenagers. And that could mean very practical things, just spending time with them, having a meal. Simple things. It doesn't have to be big, organized, going to the theme park, pretending you like roller coasters. You can just have a spaghetti dinner or have them over in your family. It doesn't have to be all just with the youth group, but just personally as well. Parents and other adults should be encouraged to talk to teenagers about faith issues. And that's not always easy, but we need to do it. We have nothing to lose when we talk to teenagers about our faith. And it doesn't mean that you talk about specific sin that you have struggled with. I don't think that's ever beneficial to know. But you can talk about your struggles and how God has saved you and let you through it. If you think in your own life about the most inspirational people, you can probably name the people that have shared that side of them. I had a teacher in high school that was my religion teacher, and he did that. And I can still remember his words. And they made such an impact of me. Not because he was a great leader and he knew it all and he had all the answers, but because he was so humble and he said, God has dragged me away from the gates of hell. And that's what he said to me. And that, to me as a teenager, made a huge impact on my faith life. And there have been other adults like that as well. Encourage the entire adult faith community, not just moms and dads, to develop meaningful relationship with teenagers. So that could be older people, That could be grandparents. Encourage adults to be proactive in starting up conversations, learning names, asking questions, and being a presence in a student's life. And maybe we're a little awkward at this in the beginning, but when you do it, you get better at it. I'm sometimes really scared about talking to teenagers, especially if they don't want to talk to me. But it's not that bad. Most of the time, it's not that bad. And maybe you come out of it and you think, oh, that was such a failure. But it's okay, just try again. And maybe ask questions that are different than, what did you think of the sermon? That's how we always think that that's what we should ask. Okay, it's not a test. They don't have to pass. It's just sharing, right? You share, I share. While spirituality formation certainly has a practical effect on a student's moral life, for example, using drugs, alcohol, sexuality, and obedience, the faith community should remain focused on developing committed disciples of Jesus and not simply good citizens. And I think that is so important. Because if we make faith a list of things that we do right or wrong, that we should do or should not do, then teenagers get discouraged. Because where do they go when they fail? The Fuller Youth Institute compares this to the Jesus jacket. They wear a jacket, and then when they go off to college, when they go out partying with their friends, when they go to their sports, they take the jacket off. And they make mistakes. They will make mistakes, just like we all do. But if we make religion, if we make faith just a jacket, then they can't put the jacket back on. Where will they go? A lot of teenagers will say the last place I will go when I do something wrong is the church. And that's where we need to be with grace, right? There's a guy called Chap Clark, and he came up with this thing that we talk a lot about ratio in youth groups and having one youth leader for 5 youth or 10 or however you have that. And he talks, what if we flip that ratio? What if we had 5 adults pouring their lives and their energy into one child, one teenager? And that can be sort of intimidating because you think like, wow, that's a lot of people. A minister once told me, when a youth walks into a church on Sunday, he needs to walk in and being able to say, that person has my back, that person I can talk to, that person I trust, that person I will go to when I need help. Does your youth have that? Do they have the relationships that they can say that I am supported by the adults in my church? When things go wrong, and things go wrong. Young people go through so many things. When they are in elementary school, most decisions are made by their parents. And all of a sudden they get into adolescence and they have to make so many decisions about school and relationships, sexuality. Where can they go to talk about that? And things happen, failed grades, they lose friends, broken hearts. One of the hardest things as a teenager. Where do you go? Where will they go? So when we're talking about 5 people pouring energy and interest into one kid, we're not just talking about 5 Bible study leaders. We're talking about adults in your church who, for example, meets a kid named Claire and remembers Claire's name. Or an adult who talks to Nathan and asks how he can be praying for him. Or pray with your youth. Teach them what it means to be praying. And maybe next week you ask Nathan how it's going with soccer. Go to their soccer games. Everyone plays soccer or hockey or something, right? Show interest into their lives. And that's where you have the most casual conversations. I'm going to end with a poem that has helped me a lot in my work with teens. I think working with teens is a really great thing because I think teenagers have so much to offer. I think once we realize that they have such a great place in our churches and our communities. But it's always hard sometimes too, because you feel like maybe they don't want me around. And at the last Root Symposium, we had an elder say that. He stood up and said, when I see you standing in your circle, I just feel like, what do I do? Do I just like go in there, or do I pull you apart? It's awkward. And I think as youth, we need to know that as well, that, you know, we need to let you in. They need to let you in. So it's hard sometimes working with teens, and we might feel like they don't need our love, but they do. Anyway, this poem is from Tessa Burke, and she was a youth worker that worked with troubled teens. And it's from her poems called I've Heard Your Feelings. And it goes as follows. Sometimes I say I hate you because I'm afraid you don't love me. The rejection I imagine from you is but a reflection of the unhappiness and uncertainty I feel within. I open to you only those doors to me which I can trust you're entering with acceptance. But at times that trust may be so tenuous as to allow only the unlatching, and there needs to be a gentle push as you knock. Sometimes the reaching for something feels safer and more predictable than allowing oneself to risk the reaching for someone. But the risking is the key to the far greater treasure. Reach out, for only by your reaching does the other know he matters to you. I saw you being the way you are. I heard you saying ways you felt, and I learned to be me.